Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more untold history in World War II. Thousands of German soldiers were brought to POW camps in America. They expected cruelty, but instead found something unexpected: the taste of America itself, with meals and kindness that stayed with them long after the war. When the war was raging across Europe and the Pacific, most Americans only saw German soldiers as shadows on the other side of the world. The newsreels showed them as an enemy cold, uniformed, marching under the banner of the swastika. They seemed distant, dangerous, and hardened. But when the United States began to capture them in large numbers, shipping them across the Atlantic and into the heart of America itself, the picture changed. These men, who had once stormed across France or guarded bunkers in North Africa, suddenly found themselves stepping off trains in small towns scattered across the Midwest and the South. They were still prisoners of war, but to many Americans, they looked less like monsters and more like tired, ragged young men. Ed is one of the little-told stories of World War II. How over 400,000 German soldiers lived behind fences on American soil between 1942 and 1945. Most Americans alive at the time remember the tension of blackouts, ration stamps, and telegrams that carried bad news. But hidden in the corners of that memory is another story, the story of those enemy soldiers now kept in wooden barracks on the edges of cornfields, cotton plantations, and desert outposts. The war had reached a point where shipping German POWs to America was the most practical choice. Britain was overcrowded with captives and feared German bombing raids might try to free them. America, with its vast open land and guarded camps, seemed far safer. And so, ship after ship carried young men in gray-green uniforms across the sea. Many of them were barely more than boys' farmhands, clerks, students drafted into a war they didn't fully understand. Some had seen battle in the sands of North Africa under Rommel. Others were captured in Italy, pulled out of trenches, or rounded up after surrendering in groups too large to fight back. When they first arrived, fear hung heavy in the air. For the Americans guarding them, there was suspicion. Would these men plot escapes, stir up trouble, or try to spread Nazi ideas? For the prisoners, there was anxiety too. They expected harsh treatment. They had heard German propaganda about America being a land of brutality and cruelty, a place where they would be starved or worked to death. And yet, when the gates closed behind them and the days stretched on, something else happened, something almost no one had expected. The camps scattered across places like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Arkansas, and even far-off Montana quickly became strange, self-contained towns. Wooden barracks stood in long lines, watchtowers rose at the corners, and barbed wire circled it all. Inside, the prisoners slept in bunks, organized their own kitchens, and sometimes even ran small clubs and theaters. The Geneva Convention required that they be treated with dignity, given proper food and shelter, and even paid for their labor. And America, determined to hold the moral high ground, followed those rules more closely than Germany ever did. At first, the German soldiers could hardly believe it. They sat down in mess halls and found their trays filled with bread, meat, potatoes, beans, more food than many of them had seen in years. Some had been half-starved while serving at the front. Now they found themselves eating 3 square meals a day, and not just scraps, but hearty American fare. Eggs at breakfast, beef stew at supper, even coffee, which had been a rare luxury back home. What struck them most was the taste. American food was different, richer, heavier, flavored in ways they had never known. Some found it overwhelming at first. They were used to dark bread and thin soups, sauerkraut, and boiled potatoes. But as the weeks turned to months, many of them developed a quiet fondness for those strange American flavors. Cornbread, sweet and warm from the oven. fried chicken with its crispy skin, apple pie served in the camp kitchens when supplies allowed at first. Some of the prisoners grumbled, clinging to the foods they missed from home. But hunger has a way of opening the heart, and soon enough, they began to eat eagerly. For many, those meals became the first real connection to America, not as an enemy nation, but as a place of plenty, a place of flavors that spoke of comfort and peace rather than war. Outside the fences, local townspeople were curious. They would sometimes gather near the camps, hoping for a glimpse of the Germans. Rumors spread quickly. Some locals were angry that these enemy soldiers were being fed so well, while American families lived under rationing. Others felt pity when they saw the prisoners so young, so far from home, sitting on the grass behind wire fences, playing makeshift soccer games with worn-out balls. Over time, work programs opened the gates. The United States was facing a severe labor shortage. So many young American men were overseas fighting that farms and factories were desperate for help. The government allowed POWs to work in nearby fields, lumber yards, and canning plants. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they truly stepped into American life. Farmers came to pick them up in trucks at dawn. The prisoners, still in their uniforms with big PW stenciled on the back, rode out to the fields. There, under the hot sun, they harvested wheat, picked cotton, or stacked hay. They were paid small wages, just enough to buy extra tobacco, soap, or writing paper at the camp store, but more than money. They were given something even more valuable, a chance to see America up close. It was on those farms that many of them tasted America in the truest sense. After a long morning in the fields, some farmers' wives would bring out cold water, lemonade, or sandwiches. The prisoners, sweaty and tired, would sit in the shade and eat. Some remembered those simple lunches for the rest of their lives. A slice of white bread with peanut butter, fresh corn on the cob dripping with butter, cold sweet tea poured over ice cubes that clinked in the glass. These were not meals of generals or politicians, but the everyday foods of ordinary Americans, and to the German soldiers, they were unforgettable. It was in those moments that something shifted. The war, the hate, the propaganda, all seemed distant, almost unreal compared to the taste of that food. The laughter of children playing nearby, the kindness of strangers who offered a plate without fear. America revealed itself not through speeches or slogans, but through a shared table, a bite of something warm and filling, a taste of home even in a foreign land. And for many of those German soldiers, those first tastes of America would linger longer than the sound of gunfire or the sting of defeat. As the months turned into years, the camps became more than just holding places. They became small windows into America itself. For the German soldiers, the fences were still there, the guards still stood watch, and the reminders of war were never far away. Yet inside those boundaries, a strange sort of normal life began to take shape. Every morning, the prisoners rose at the sound of the bugle or the clatter of footsteps. They shaved, washed, and lined up for breakfast. Pancakes and syrup, oatmeal, bacon if the rations stretched that far. For some, the sweetness of syrup was almost too much at first. They laughed about it, joked that Americans must love sugar more than air. But soon, many developed a taste for it, drizzling it thickly over stacks of golden cakes, learning to savor the way it stuck to their fingers. After breakfast, work assignments were called out. Some remained in camp, where they tended vegetable gardens, chopped wood, or maintained the barracks. Others were sent out under armed escort to nearby farms or factories. They rode in the backs of trucks, the American countryside unfolding before their eyes. Long stretches of cornfields, red barns, winding dirt roads shaded by oak and pine. For many of the young soldiers, this was the first time they had seen so much land untouched by war. No bomb craters, no burned villages, no ruins, just green fields and the quiet hum of tractors. It was on those farms where real bonds began to form. At first, the Americans and Germans kept a distance. Farmers spoke little German, prisoners spoke little English, and mistrust ran deep. But work has a way of drawing people together. Sweat, soil, and shared effort broke down walls faster than words ever could. Soon, simple phrases bridged the gap. Here, danke, good, more. They learned each other's names, sometimes shortening them into nicknames that rolled easier off the tongue by midday. When the sun pressed down heavy on their backs, the farm families often brought out food. The prisoners, sitting in the grass or on wooden steps, bit into things they had never tasted before. Cold fried chicken left over from Sunday's supper. Biscuits baked fresh that morning, split open with butter melting inside. Slices of watermelon, so sweet and dripping that juice ran down their arms. They laughed like children, trying to catch the seeds as they spit them into the dirt. For the Americans, it was strange too. These were enemy soldiers' men who had once fought under Hitler's flag, now sitting at their tables, sipping cold milk, nodding politely. Some locals never forgave it. They muttered that the Germans were being spoiled while American boys were dying in Europe. Yet others looked at the pale, weary faces of the prisoners and saw not enemies, but sons. Many were just 19 or 20. No older than the farm boys already buried under white crosses in faraway fields. Letters home told the story in quieter ways. Some German soldiers wrote to their families about the food, describing flavors they couldn't quite explain. Ate something called a hot dog. One man scribbled in pencil, a sausage in bread with yellow paste they call mustard. It is simple but good. Another described ice cream cold, sweet, creamy, something he had only dreamed of before. These letters, heavily censored but still filled with detail, carried back across the ocean tales of a strange and almost gentle captivity. Inside the camps, food became its own kind of bridge. The prisoners cooked when allowed, sometimes trading recipes with American guards. They baked rye bread in makeshift ovens, boiled sauerkraut when they could gather cabbage from the gardens. On rare occasions, camp authorities permitted them to prepare a proper German meal, which they shared with curious Americans. In return, guards sometimes brought in treats from town: Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, chewing gum. The soldiers tasted them with delight, surprised at how something so simple could bring so much pleasure. Music and food often went hand in hand. In the evenings, after supper, the prisoners gathered with guitars, harmonicas, or handmade violins. Songs from the homeland drifted across the barbed wire, mixed with laughter. Sometimes even joined by American guards who recognized a tune. And always there was coffee brewing, its rich smell hanging in the air. Coffee became a ritual, almost sacred. For the Germans, it was a piece of home, and for the Americans, it was a gesture of familiarity. Around tin mugs of steaming coffee. They were no longer soldier and guard, enemy and prisoner. They were just men, far from home, clinging to warmth in a world that had grown cold. There were moments of conflict, of course. Not every prisoner adjusted easily. Some remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi cause, refusing American food, spitting on what they saw as enemy poison. Fights broke out between pro-Nazi hardliners and others who simply wanted to survive. The camp commanders watched carefully, separating the most dangerous ideologues when necessary. But for the majority, survival and curiosity outweighed politics. And little by little, they discovered America through its simplest gifts: meals. Shared kindness shown, laughter found in unexpected places. The local towns felt it too. Children sometimes gathered near the fences, curious about the men behind the wire. Some brave souls tossed apples or candy across when the guards weren't looking. The prisoners waved and called out words they barely knew. Hello. Thank you. on work crews. Children sometimes stood by shyly until one of the Germans pulled a coin from his pocket, Pfennig. Worn smooth from Travelland, pressed it into their hand as a keepsake. All those small exchanges, quiet and human, left lasting impressions on both sides. Perhaps the most powerful moments came during holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter days that reminded both Americans and Germans of home. The camp kitchens prepared feasts, stretching supplies to offer turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The German soldiers ate with wide eyes, marveling at the richness of it all. Some sang carols in their own tongue, while American guards joined in with English verses. On Christmas Eve, handmade decorations hung from barrack walls, and wooden carvings crafted from scrap were exchanged as gifts. The food that night roast meat, potatoes, sweet desserts was remembered not as a prisoner's meal, but as a celebration of shared humanity in the midst of war. For the German soldiers, these tastes of America became more than meals. They were symbols of something they had not expected to find: dignity, kindness, and a glimpse of life unscarred by bombs and fear. They came to understand that America was not only a powerful enemy, but also a land of abundance, generosity, and hope. Years later, many would say it was the food, the simple, everyday meals that stayed with them most. The sweetness of cornbread, the tang of barbecue, the freshness of fruit pulled straight from a tree. Two men who had grown up in a Germany marked by scarcity, then plunged into a war of destruction. These flavors were more than nourishment. They were memories of peace, a promise of what life could be when hatred no longer ruled. And though they could not yet know it, these experiences would shape their views of America long after the war ended, long after the fences came down and the ships carried them home. By the middle of 1944, the war in Europe was shifting. News filtered into the camps in bits and pieces through censored letters, through the guarded words of American soldiers, through whispers that traveled faster than any newspaper. The Germans inside the barbed wire knew their country was faltering. The Allied invasion of France had begun, and the rumors of advancing Soviet armies on the Eastern Front reached even to the heart of America. For many of the prisoners, the fences around them no longer felt like the worst of their worries. What lay ahead for Germany, for their families back home, weighed heavier on their hearts than captivity itself. Life in the camps took on a rhythm. Wake up, eat, work, return, eat again, lights out. Yet within that rhythm, the prisoners kept carving out pieces of normal life. They built gardens behind the barracks, planting rows of vegetables in neat lines. Some fashioned furniture out of scrap wood, carving chairs, tables, even little toys. Others turned to art, drawing portraits of their comrades, sketching the faces of guards, painting landscapes of a home they might never see again. But always, food remained at the center of daily life. Food was the comfort, the constant, the thing that brought men together at the end of each weary day. And as time passed, the German prisoners learned to enjoy the little surprises of American kitchens. In some camps, they were allowed to set up bakeries. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, the crusts browned perfectly in makeshift ovens. They traded recipes with American cooks' rye bread for biscuits, pretzels for cornbread. In one camp, they even brewed beer from stolen or gifted ingredients, though when discovered, it was quickly shut down with stern warnings. Still, the laughter that accompanied those experiments showed something deeper. The barriers between enemy and host were wearing down. On the farms, the bonds grew stronger. Farmers came to know the men who worked their fields, not just as prisoners, but as people. A farmer might hand a German worker a sandwich with a wink and say, "Don't tell the guard." Another might bring out his children, letting them shake hands with men who had once been called the enemy. In return, the Germans worked hard, often more than was expected. For men raised on discipline, Labor was no punishment, tit was a familiar rhythm, one that gave them pride and dignity. And when a farm family shared their table, even briefly, it became a moment that carried weight for years to come. One prisoner, later, recalled sitting down to a summer meal after a long day of work. The family placed before him corn on the cob, mashed potatoes, fried chicken, and peach cobbler for dessert. He said that for a moment, he forgot he was a prisoner at all. He felt like a guest, and that feeling, he admitted, shook him more than any gun or battlefield ever had. Inside the camps, guards often noticed the change too. At first, many had been suspicious, even hostile toward their captives. They remembered friends lost overseas, and sometimes found it hard to look at these young Germans without bitterness. But day after day, year after year, they saw the same faces. They saw them laugh, work, write letters, sing songs, bow their heads in prayer. Slowly, it became impossible to see them only as enemies. They were men's sons, brothers, fathers caught up in the same storm of war that had swept the world. Of course, not every American welcomed the idea of prisoners being treated kindly. In towns where rationing cut deep and families grieved the loss of their own sons, seeing German soldiers well-fed and even cheerful sparked anger. There were protests, angry letters to newspapers, and demands that the government treat the prisoners with harsher measures. Yet the United States held to the Geneva Convention, determined to show the world, and perhaps itself, that even in the hardest times, it would not abandon its principles. This treatment did not go unnoticed. For the German prisoners, the contrast was sharp. They knew how Allied prisoners were treated in Germany, how American and British captives often went hungry, faced brutal winters without coats, or suffered under cruel guards. To sit at a table in America and eat meat, potatoes, bread, and pie was not only a comfort, it was a revelation. Some of them struggled with shame, knowing their own nation had not shown the same mercy. That shame often turned into reflection. Around the barracks tables, men talked late into the night. They spoke of the future, of what would become of Germany after the war, of what they had seen in America. Many agreed that they had never imagined a land so vast, so rich, so filled with ordinary kindness. They spoke of the taste of cornmeal, the strange delight of soda pop fizzing on the tongue, the generosity of farmers who offered second helpings even to prisoners. They wondered aloud if this was the real America, not the monstrous caricature painted by Nazi propaganda, but a place where ordinary life could flourish without fear. There were darker moments too. News reached the camps of bombings, back home cities flattened, families scattered, hunger spreading. Some men wept openly when letters brought news of loved ones lost. The taste of American food, so plentiful and sweet, sometimes turned bitter. In those moments, a reminder of what their own people were enduring across the ocean. Still, for many, it planted a seed. If America could be so generous even to its enemies, perhaps there was a future in which old hatreds could give way to something better. As 1945 drew near, that future became more certain. The end of the war was coming, though no one yet knew when. In the camps, the mood was tense, half hope, half dread. For the prisoners, the thought of returning home was both joyful and frightening. What would they find in Germany? What would become of their families, their homes, their cities? Would they be welcomed or shunned for surrendering? And still, life went on. Meals were served, work was done. Songs were sung at night under the stars. A guard might share a cigarette with a prisoner. A farmer's wife might slip an extra biscuit into a lunch bag. These small acts carried meaning far beyond their size. They showed that even in the midst of war, even between enemies, humanity could survive. Many of the Germans would later say that it was in America that they first discovered the meaning of dignity. Not through speeches or politics, but through food placed before them without malice. Every bite was a reminder that kindness could exist even when the world was burning. And that taste of America, the sweetness of pie, the warmth of bread, the comfort of coffee would linger with them long after they walked free. The fences would not hold forever. The end was drawing near. And when it came, the memories of those meals, those friendships, those small mercies, would travel back across the sea with them, carried in their hearts as surely as the scars of war. Asterisk. By the spring of 1945, the war that had thrown the world into chaos was nearing its violent end. Inside the American POW camps, the German soldiers sensed it before the official announcements ever reached them. Guards grew quieter, newspapers carried headlines that could not be hidden, and the prisoners themselves, listening to radio fragments, reading censored letters, knew the truth. Germany was collapsing. Cities were in ruins, millions displaced, millions more dead. For those men sitting behind fences in America, the thought of going home was both a hope and a fear. The surrender of Germany in May was not met with celebration inside the camps. There were no cheers, no parades. For many, it was a moment of silence, heavy with uncertainty. Home no longer meant what it once had. Some wondered if their families still lived. Others feared the shame that would come with returning in defeat. And yet, at the same time, a strange gratitude stirred within them. They had survived. They had been fed, clothed, sheltered. They had been treated not as monsters, but as men. That in itself was no small miracle. In the weeks that followed, the camps began to change. The rigid schedules loosened. The guards seemed less strict, and talk of repatriation filled the air. The fences still stood, but the end was visible. Prisoners began to carve keepsakes out of wood boxes, toys, small carvings of eagles or crosses to give to American guards as parting gifts. Some wrote letters of thanks, awkward in broken English, but heartfelt all the same. And always they remembered the food. They joked among themselves that they had gained weight in captivity, that America had fed them better than their own army ever had. The taste of hamburgers, apple pie, coffee, and fried chicken had etched itself into their memory. Some tried to learn how to cook these things, scribbling down recipes as best they could. A few even dreamed of opening bakeries or restaurants. Back home, bringing a piece of America with them. When the orders finally came, the process of sending them back was long and uneven. Some were shipped to Britain first, others held for months before transport. But eventually, trains carried them to ports, and ships carried them across the Atlantic. As they boarded, many looked back at the land they were leaving, the wide fields, the small towns, the skies unscarred by war. It was not home, but it had given them something they had not expected. A glimpse of life beyond hatred. A taste of freedom they would never forget. Back in Germany, the shock was overwhelming. Cities lay in rubble. Streets, where they had once played as children, were reduced to ashes. Food was scarce. Hunger gnawed at the population. For men who had spent years behind American fences, the contrast was stark. They had left a land of plenty where bread and meat were served daily, where pie and coffee were ordinary, and returned to a homeland where mothers stood in line for hours just to get a crust of bread. Many felt guilty for the full stomachs they had carried home from captivity, yet at the same time, those memories gave them hope. They had seen that another kind of life was possible, that nations did not have to be ruled by cruelty and fear. Some former prisoners spoke openly of their experiences. They told neighbors about American farms, about the kindness of families who had offered lemonade on hot days, about the guards who had shared cigarettes and laughter. They spoke of the taste of ice cream on a summer afternoon, the smell of fried chicken drifting from a farmhouse kitchen, the way children had waved to them with smiles instead of scorn. These stories seemed unbelievable to many Germans who had been told for years that America was a land of cruelty. And yet, the returned soldiers swore it was true. Over time, these memories became part of something larger. They shaped how many Germans saw America after the war. When the Marshall Plan brought food and aid to rebuild Europe, it felt like an extension of what many POWs had already seen. America not only as a conqueror, but as a provider, a nation that shared abundance rather than hoarded it. For some, it planted seeds of admiration, even friendship, that would grow in the decades to come, even years later. When those former prisoners grew old and told their grandchildren of the war, their stories often came back to the same simple images: sitting at a long table in a wooden barracks, eating stew and bread until they were full, drinking cold milk from a farm in Texas, tasting peanut butter for the first time, puzzled and delighted all at once, laughing with a farmer's child as watermelon juice dripped down their chin. These were the things they carried, the memories that softened the sharp edges of war. For the Americans who had lived near those camps, the memories lingered too. Some still remembered the sight of German prisoners working in their fields, the sound of foreign songs carried on the wind, the shock of realizing the enemy could look so much like their own sons. A few friendships, rare but real, lasted through letters exchanged long after the war. Farmers received postcards from Germany with thanks for kindness shown. Guards received small packages, wooden carvings, old photos sent by men who had once sat behind their barbed wire. History often remembers war in numbers, battles fought, bombs dropped, lives lost. But hidden within those numbers are stories like these, where the enemy became human, where food shared across a table spoke louder than propaganda. The German soldiers in America discovered something they never expected to find in captivity: the taste of another life, a glimpse of dignity, a memory of kindness that endured long after the guns fell silent. For them, America was not only the land that defeated their army, it was the land that fed them, treated them, and, in quiet ways, changed them. And long after they left, long after the fences came down and the barracks were torn apart, they remembered the taste of America not just in the food that filled their bellies, but in the spirit of generosity that touched their hearts. That is the story of those German prisoners in the United States. Story not of battles or victories, but of meals shared, of humanity found in the unlikeliest of places. It is a story of how, in the darkest of times, something as simple as a piece of bread, a slice of pie, or a glass of cold milk could remind even enemies of their shared humanity. And it is a story worth remembering, for it tells us that sometimes history is not only written in blood and fire, but in kindness, in mercy, and in the unforgettable taste of peace.